Hello, I'm Earl Weinberg, and this is Book Circle Presents An Ever-Mounted Cavalry. Our protagonist, Ivy, has just discovered that her good friend, Brother Eugene, is not really an old man who almost always rides a horse, but was magically disguised and is in fact a centaur. He has explained to her that this is a recent development. He's only recently become a centaur. And she asks him how that happened, and he told her, well, there's a story. The Casualty. Brother Eugene clung tightly to Mauropus as they sped through the Alps toward the sunrise. The horse churned his legs in the air as if swimming, but that had no bearing on their travel. They skimmed through snow-choked valleys, up, then down slopes that were more like cliffs, then through flickers of light that must be little towns just waking. Mauropus churned on dreamily. He must be in a trance, Eugene thought. He only wished he was himself. The ride was an insane rush, but long enough for his legs to cramp. He knew he ought to relax, but could not. He would be a rag when they finally landed. Holy Martin! They soared over a chasm. On his right, he heard Chio laugh. Laurent, ahead of him, and David to his left, gasped like reasonable mortals. But Chio? A line from the play Peter Pan drifted through Brother Eugene's mind. To die would be an awfully big adventure. No, don't think like that. Certainly not about any of these youngsters. Was the dawn light growing so quickly just because time passed, or because they were dashing east that fast, adding appreciably to Earth's rotation? Now they skimmed over a frozen lake. A mountain lurched up before them like a breaching whale, and it seemed they were bounding from point to point up to the peak with no sign of stopping there. But they did stop. They arrived as abruptly as a bullet at its target. Suddenly, Mauropus was stumbling and blowing, as were all the other horses. They were on a pavement, a courtyard perhaps, crowded with all the horses of the expedition. Around on three sides rose rough, snowy rock. The fourth side sank away to a view of the frozen lake they had just crossed. Up among the boulders, pale blue lights gleamed. Chio stood up in his stirrups and looked around. Kessler out, he pronounced with satisfaction, and we were in Dymchurch just an hour ago. As little as that, wondered Brother Eugene. It had seemed ages. He watched the blue lights among the rocks. They moved, working their way down to the pavement, and soon showed themselves to be lanterns, each lighting the way of 4 or 5 dwarves. The dwarves gathered and stopped on the slope a few feet above the pavement so they could remain eye to eye with the figures that worked their way out of the crowd to meet them. In front was Dellingsdottir, a woman leading the Jossalfar who had brought them here. She was slim and straight and beautiful, of course, ivory-skinned with flowing platinum hair, and, yes, probably in actuality a little luminous. She wore white and gold silks, and if the cold bothered her, she gave no sign. Brother Eugene was fairly sure she did not notice it. She rode a nightbred, a tall, lean horse that moved like a restless cat, gray as a cloud, with a white underbelly and, Eugene knew, though he could not see it from here, cat-green eyes, too. It was a fairy breed, adapted for flits and wild hunts. 6 other such horses and riders were mixed in among the mortals. Dellingsdottir grinned, clearly elated by her deed, as she spoke what Eugene trusted were courteous words to the dwarven party. They looked solemn but not upset. The expedition was, after all, expected and permitted. All were massively and elaborately bearded, as one would expect, and dressed more appropriately for the cold in rich, fur-trimmed robes of white, blue, and violet. Behind the Jossalf came King Geoffrey and his sons, the princes Oliver and Hugh. Their horses were fine, but seemed like jointed statues next to the swirling fog the elf rode. The king spoke his own fair words to the dwarves. Eugene wondered if they spoke Sindarin or Wental or what. A dwarf with white robe and beard answered him. The exchange went on for some time and culminated with the dwarf handing a thick packet to the king. Geoffrey and Sons bowed their heads low in gratitude. "It rankles me a bit," said David, "to see our king so humble." "Humility is a virtue," Brother Eugene replied, "and our kingdom hangs in a net of fairy friendships. Our king is not going to fray any strands of that net." "What did they hand him?" Chio wondered. "Directions, I should think," Laurent answered, "for where we go from here." "No guide? We shall see." There was no guide. The long file of men and horses found its way down a charmed path from Castleralp and then split into 3 companies, seeking the Desalonians, the folk they hoped to ally with. "Why didn't these Desalonians just tell us where to meet them?" Chio grumbled on the 4th day of struggling through deep snow and rough terrain. "They couldn't," Brother Eugene answered. "Their passage moves about. You did know they were from out of zone, right?" Yes, I knew that," Chio said impatiently. "A Fey realm." "Maybe," Eugene answered. It sounded as if Chio had his information from Scuttlebutt. "It was Fays put us in touch with each other, but the Desalonians we've contacted are human." "There are the centaurs," Chio qualified. "Yes, that will be interesting." "No Grand Norman has seen a centaur for centuries," Laurent said. "We don't even know if they're Fays or a tribe of Jinn or golems or what." "How could they be golems?" asked Chio. "Well, animations of some kind. Elemental-based sendings, maybe. Their origin myths all connect with water and mist." Chio grunted, then asked, "What's going on up ahead?" They stood, surrounded by other cavalry riders and their horses, knee-deep in snow at the bottom of a valley. Up ahead, the valley narrowed and wound out of view. No one was moving. David, who had been talking to other folk in the crowd, passed on the hearsay. "The brass are jawing with the scryers." "Military scheduling," Chio sighed. This was a little traditional joke among the 4 of them, noting how military life included as much lengthy waiting as it did long work shifts. A cavalryman came limping over. He had fallen off his horse and wrenched his ankle yesterday on rocks over smooth-looking snow. Laurent was tending it with liniment and bandages. It was something to do. Laurent was a cavalry medic. So had Brother Eugene been in his day. He had retired just as the war was breaking out, then been called back after a few months of inactivity. As a half or quarter-hearted concession to his retired status, he was now supply sergeant and aide-de-camp to Laurent, his own former pupil. It was true the work would have been simpler if, 1, he and Laurent had not naturally fallen into their old habits of teamwork, and 2, they had not been called out on this extraordinary expedition. They had been given Chio and David as assistants. Neither had enough training to qualify even as orderlies. David Arns was an ordinary cavalryman, or as ordinary as you could be in the cavalry of a sundered nation like Grand Normandy. Chio, proper name Cosimo della Foresta, was too, officially. But Chio was a Benandante, member of a clan of Italian werewolves, whose trick was not physical transformation, but astral projection in wolf form. When he had a little more cavalry experience, he would join his cousins and uncles among the masters of hounds. "The scryers are all excited," Laurent's patient told them. "They think we're on the right track." A horse came pushing through the crowd. Its rider wore a lieutenant's insignia and pointed at Chio. "Boy, you're Benandante?" Chio sat up straight in his saddle and saluted. "Yes, sir." "Can you reach the other Benandante on the expedition, the ones in the other divisions?" "Yes, sir. You're to deliver a message to all of them. They're to inform Prince Oliver and General Lord Fitzsimmons that we expect to contact the Desalonians within the next 2 to 4 hours, and they should join us as soon as possible. Depart at once." "Yes, sir." The lieutenant turned his horse and started his return to the front of the company. Chio checked the time on his watch, then closed his eyes and inhaled deeply. On the 7th deep breath, he slumped forward. David jumped off Jojo and caught him as he slid off sideways. Brother Eugene, already off Moripus, helped him lower the boy onto the snow. A mist, like warm breath vapor, rose from Chio, coming from his whole head and torso. It formed into a wolf, gray-white and barely visible. It looked around. Eugene met its eyes. It grinned back, then shot off into the air like an arrow. They waited. Brother Eugene got a blanket out of the packs and, with Lawrence's help, got it under Chio's body so the boy would not return to find himself cold and soaking. Other riders gathered around to look at Chio and speculate about the news. About half an hour later, even less visibly than it had left, a thin vapor that might have been wolf-shaped poured down from the sky into the boy's body. He jerked, shuddered, and opened his eyes. "I did it!" He sat up. "We did it! They must have sent every Benandante here!" "I'm sure," Eugene agreed. "Congratulations, pup, your first military outwalking." Chio rose, wobbling. "I got a report." Laurent made him stand, breathing deeply for a full minute, making sure he was pointed in the right direction, and let him stagger off. It took more time than had his astral flight for Chio to work his way up to the brass at the head of the procession, report, and work his way back. But when he arrived, he was excited. "Their passage is coming," he declared. "You can feel it even if you're not a scryer. They say it's a... Look!" He pointed down the canyon, back the way he had come. A whirlwind of snow, a snow devil, was working its way down the twists of the canyon, then came to a stop somewhere a little beyond where Eugene reckoned the king and the top officers must stand waiting for a whirlwind. "If that's their passage," Eugene muttered, "they must be able to steer it, at least some, I hope." It seemed they could. The snow devil came to a halt, spread out at the base, and issued a cloud of snow. Eugene and his friends were too far back to see more, but he learned later that the Thessalonians came marching out of the snow cloud. He did see long poles with some sort of knobs on top, standards, he supposed. Certainly he saw the red and blue banners of Grand Normandy unfurl, their gold lions and fleur-de-lis shining, and heard trumpet sounds in greeting to their new allies. Their potential new allies, or their new mercenaries, or no deal. Nothing had been decided yet. Then there was more waiting. At length, riders and runners came through the standing troops with news and directions. The Thessalonians needed room to come through the passage and wanted to mingle with the Grand Normans to become acquainted. Therefore, all of them were to spread out and move back down the canyon, moving further from that standing snow devil. There followed an hour of chaos. Men and horses milled about, churning the snow into trampled ice. Eugene and Laurent and their aides, plus horses, wound up to a near spur of rock. "That's where Fitzsimmons and Prince Hugh will come through," said Chio, pointing up the other side of the spur. "At least that's what I figure from what I saw. Couldn't stick around to hear the talk." Brother Eugene nodded. Then they all turned to look back down the canyon where the snow devil still stood. The Thessalonians had been pouring through as the Grand Normans had been spreading out, so it was not long before they saw a traffic of figures very like themselves, though less like as it approached. Men on foot, horses being led, men mounted, and what looked like mounted men at first, centaurs, actual centaurs, the first Brother Eugene had ever seen. He had known fays all his life, had stepped out of the home zone many times and seen many curious creatures, but not these. And the same was true for every Grand Norman here. They moved in pairs, seeking out little groups of Grand Normans. Their own guests approached, 2 centaurs each with a rider. They halted in front of Brother Eugene's foursome, and the 2 groups studied each other. The centaur before him was huge. The equine part was not a large horse, and the human part was not a large man, but with the man's waist coinciding with the horse's withers, he was over 7 feet tall. As horse, he was a bay, brown with black legs and tail. As man, he looked European, black-haired, brown-eyed, but fair-skinned, with perhaps a little Asiatic tint to it. It was hard to tell if his eyes looked Asian because he wore heavy eyeliner. He wore a helmet with nasal and cheek plates. The helmet, in fact, looked a lot like an ancient Greek helmet with a high, bristly crest. Horsehair, no doubt. His own hair? But there was a rope or queue hanging down the back that let the horsehair crest continue. It was a sort of wig, Brother Eugene realized, presenting a horse's mane. There were other ways in which he made himself look still horsier. The helmet bore felt horse ears. He had painted his fingertips, but not his thumbs, black so as to look like hooves. He wore his hair in a ponytail, and his beard, which was long and full, was bound just under his chin in a sort of frontal ponytail. For that matter, the eyeliner made his eyes look big and round and dark, like a horse's. There was more. He wore a leather breastplate bearing swirls in red and blue, resembling the knotwork designs of Celtic or Scandinavian art. The central design, Eugene realized, represented a horse's face. So symbolically, he was a complete horse. On each hip, or at least on the hip Eugene could see, was a knotwork representation of a galloping horse done in some kind of blue paint. Was there any magic to the symbols? Eugene tried to feel the other heat that marked magic in his imagination. There were little clusters of it about him, about all 4 Thessalonians, but it didn't seem to be in these symbols. More mundanely, he had a sword on his left hip, horse shoulder, and a crossbow on his right over a coil of rope. His rider carried no reins, and no wonder, but had a musket or some long gun with a flaring mouth slung across his back. He carried a coil of rope and held a spear with the butt resting in a kind of holster or scabbard, a little cup on his stirrup. The rider sat on a lightly made saddle on top of a thick saddle pad of blue-dyed wool. He wore leather armor like the centaurs, though his knotwork patterns made no pictures. Underneath the armor, he wore heavy woolens. The centaur, on the other hand, wore nothing under the breastplate. Did the cold really not bother him, perhaps due to his size, or was he posing as tough? Surely there was a bit of padding directly under the leather. The rider had the same general coloring as the centaur, the human part of him, but wore his hair collar length and his beard short. His helmet had no cheek plates or nasal and a much more modest crest. Was he subordinate to the centaur? No way to ask politely, even if they had a common language. The rider looked studiously blank, but his posture suggested caution. The centaur, on the other hand, conveyed nothing of the sort. He approached until he was well within arm's reach, then stared down at Eugene and Chio, and Moripus and Zamponi. The horses might be just as important. Brother Eugene could not get a close look at the other centaur and rider. They were busy looming over Laurent and David, but they seemed much of a muchness with his pair. The main difference was the second centaur carried a standard, a long pole holstered like the rider's spear, with a ring on top about a cubit wide. In the ring were a number of carved curls painted white. A stylized cloud? Brother Eugene turned back to the centaur before him and essayed a polite smile. It was ignored. The centaur swept his gaze over Eugene and Chio. There was no threatening glare, but there was no attempt at engagement. He might have been looking at rocks. He said something gruff to his rider, who answered briefly in monotone. Language, right. Pedil Sindarin? Brother Eugene asked. Do you speak Sindarin? The centaur ignored him, but the rider stared back for a couple of seconds, then answered, Miu, small. Brother Eugene gave a sympathetic smile and replied, Arim, and I, though in fact he had a reading knowledge of Sindarin and basic conversational skill. Then he wondered what Thessalonians thought of acting modest. The centaur said something to the rider, not in Sindarin, still looking over the group. At the moment, he seemed most interested in Chio and Zamponi. The rider was silent for a bit, then asked, Man Lebir. What horses? What's up? Asked David. He wants to talk about horses, Eugene answered. A reasonable suggestion. Everyone here works with horses, some very closely. But what to say about horses when both parties are experts and have hardly any language in common? In the simplest Sindarin he could manage, Eugene began talking about the individual horses. This is Moripus. He is an old gelding. He is clumsy, but he is tough and he is calm. I like him very much. This is Zamponi. A third centaur arrived. He had a rider on his back and a second rider on a horse. His beard and ponytail were gray. Eugene wondered if he could conclude that centaurs were mortal. When the first two centaurs noticed his approach, they wheeled quickly in place and gave quick, sharp nods that Eugene suspected were salutes. The senior was styled differently. Everything was white. The horsehair crest and mane wig, the curlicues on his breastplate, even his saddle pad. His rider carried another standard with the maybe cloud symbol atop, and the rider, too, was trimmed all in white, as was the rider on the accompanying horse. Eugene paused in his lecture while the three centaurs spoke among themselves. It appeared the senior was questioning the other two. The riders said nothing. Eventually, the senior spoke to Brother Eugene's interlocutor, who turned back to him and said, "Bado, go." Eugene looked into the senior's face and nodded, deliberately slight and slow, "Namarie, be well." The senior met his eyes, inclined his head very slightly, and said, "Leno, proceed." Eugene finished introducing the horses and decided it was time to introduce the people. He introduced Laurent as a healer and himself and the others as his helpers. He paused for a few seconds to see if any Thessalonians introduced themselves. No. Their gaze was so impersonal, attentive but unengaged, that it made Brother Eugene conscious of the weight of the revolver at his hip. Casting about for a new topic and not feeling it was yet his turn to ask questions, he told David, "Show them how you unsaddle Jojo." Eugene then tried to narrate this. The senior centaur interrupted with a remark in a firm tone. The first centaur made some objection. Suddenly an argument broke out among all of them, centaurs and riders alike, with no obvious deference given to the senior centaur. But then the senior said something in a decisive tone. The first centaur reared. In one smooth motion, he rose on his hind legs, and his rider stayed on, expecting it, drew his crossbow, and shot David before he even reached his top height. Once up there, he bellowed louder than a man could, "Bordu!" The entire Thessalonian party, both species, roared "Bordu" a moment later. Eugene attended with only a fraction of his mind. With the rest of it, medic or not, monk or not, he pulled his revolver and shot the first centaur. Fool, he cursed himself a moment later. Not only was there the leather breastplate, he did not even know if the heart, or a heart, was in the human chest. The centaur was coming down from its rearing. While the horse chest was exposed, Eugene shot into it. "Horse chest!" he yelled for Chio or Laurent. "Shoot the horse chest!" For the centaur at least staggered from the shot, but he was still reloading the bow. He stared blearily at Eugene, aimed, and shot. It struck square in the chest. Eugene toppled back, expecting the agony to start, or the darkness. Instead, the inexpressible struck. He was swelling, splintering. As a medic, he had run into descriptions of many odd problems. There was a hallucination where you felt you were much too big or too small, like Alice. He heard "Bordu" repeated all around, and yells and shots. His eyes were open, and he was staring up at mountainside and snow. He still had his pistol. He struggled to rise. Rocks dug into his back and into his side. His side. His legs thrashed. There was something wrong. He tried to turn over and could not. something held him back. Suddenly he had help. Someone was helping him rise. Two. There was a rope around his chest, another around his chest again, and the first centaur was hauling on them. His erstwhile rider was shoving at Eugene's side, but not his side. They were seizing him. They had forgotten about the revolver. He shot the rider in the chest. He shot the centaur in the neck, aiming for the head. Down they went. The last thing they had tried to do was make him rise. He stood and knew. Centaurs were not jinn or elementals or golems. They were made from mortals. He gazed about. The second centaur and his rider were hauling on a third centaur, hauling on his arms, and a rope looped behind his forelegs. The third centaur was David. He was going with them, not willingly, not even knowingly. Eugene had 3 bullets left. He shot at David's captors, missing the rider, hitting the centaur in the hip. They fled. So now we know how Eugene became a centaur in heat of battle under magical attack. And we'll find more about this battle next time.